You said before it was a disaster.
It was the worst experience of my life.
Tell me about it.
Eddie was completely whacked out off the charts on alcohol and drugs, and poor guy, I mean, he was really in bad shape. I thought he was going to die.
He may be hailed as a guitar god, but not everyone worshipped at his altar. Eddie Van Halen revolutionized rock music with his blistering solos and groundbreaking techniques, yet behind the curtain, he sparked rivalries, feuds, and plenty of resentment. Some rockers admired his talent but despised his ego, while others clashed with his competitive nature. The story of why so many couldn't stand Eddie is as wild as his legendary riffs. Fred Durst of Limp Bizkit. Among the countless wild tales in rock history, few are as bizarre and as shocking as the story of Eddie Van Halen allegedly putting a gun to Fred Durst's head after a failed jam session. It's a story that combines rock and roll excess, clashing personalities, and Eddie's volatile streak, ultimately becoming one of the most legendary anecdotes to surface about the late guitarist. The strange saga began when a record label executive decided to play matchmaker between two unlikely worlds, Van Halen and Limp Bizkit. Eddie, long considered one of the greatest guitarists of all time, was introduced to Fred Durst, the backwards hat-wearing frontman of one of the most controversial nu metal bands of the late 90s. Eddie, who at the time was experimenting with collaborations outside of Van Halen, partied with Durst and even floated the idea of working together. Durst, never one to shy away from sarcasm, quipped that it would be hilarious. The greatest guitar player ever plays with the worst band ever. Despite the backhanded comment, the two agreed to meet for a jam session. But the experiment was doomed from the start. Eddie, a meticulous musician, described the experience as like being a scholar amongst kindergartners. What pushed him over the edge, however, wasn't the musicianship, but the atmosphere. When people began smoking marijuana, a habit Eddie openly despised, he abruptly fled the session, leaving behind some of his most prized possessions, his guitars and amplifiers. Over the next day, Eddie tried repeatedly to get in touch with Durst to retrieve his gear. His calls went unanswered. For Eddie, whose instruments were practically sacred, this was unacceptable. After 24 hours of waiting, his frustration boiled over. According to Andrew Bennett, a video director who recounted the story in his book Eruption in the Canyon, Eddie decided to take matters into his own hands, literally. Bennett claims Eddie arrived at Durst's house in his assault vehicle, a military-style van outfitted with gun mounts. Carrying a firearm, Eddie confronted Durst directly. When Fred opened the door, he found himself staring down the barrel of a gun. Eddie, pointing it at Durst's iconic red baseball cap, allegedly snarled, "I put my gun to that stupid effing red hat of his and I said, 'Where's my stuff, mother effer?'" The confrontation sent Durst into panic mode. Instead of arguing, he immediately turned to one of his employees and barked at him to gather Eddie's equipment. Meanwhile, Eddie stood watch, keeping the gun fixed on Durst as his amps and guitars were ferried out of the house and loaded back into his vehicle. Bennett described the surreal scene with disbelief. An icon of classic rock holding a nu metal star at gunpoint over a set of instruments. While neither Eddie nor Durst ever publicly confirmed the story, Bennett's account has been widely circulated and dissected in the rock community. For many, it epitomizes Eddie's unpredictable nature. Though beloved for his genius on the guitar, Eddie was also known for his fiery temper and his intolerance for people he didn't respect. Fred Durst, infamous for his cocky attitude and divisive reputation, was an easy target for Eddie's wrath. Randy Rhoads. Few debates in rock history stir as much passion among fans as the rivalry between Randy Rhoads and Eddie Van Halen. Both guitarists were young, innovative, and redefining what the electric guitar could do in the late 70s and early 80s. They shared a similar blend of classical influences, blistering speed, and groundbreaking use of techniques like two-handed tapping, which made comparisons inevitable. But beyond fan speculation, the two guitarists themselves reportedly carried a mutual disdain, creating one of rock's most enduring rivalries. Eddie, already a household name by the early 80s thanks to Van Halen's meteoric rise, often dismissed Rhoads when asked about him in interviews. In 1982, he made one of his most infamous remarks. "Everything he did, he learned from me. I don't really think he did anything that I haven't done." To Eddie, Randy was more imitator than innovator, a guitarist riding on the coattails of techniques Eddie himself had pioneered. The press amplified this tension. Rolling Stone magazine's review of Ozzy Osbourne's 1981 album Diary of a Madman praised Rhoads' technical skill, but referred to him as a junior league Eddie Van Halen, suggesting that while he had the chops, he lacked originality. Such comparisons fueled the fire, framing Rhoads as Eddie's understudy rather than his equal. But those who knew Randy saw him differently. His combination of classical music theory, compositional precision, and flair set him apart. Where Eddie leaned into wild improvisation and fiery stage presence, Randy was disciplined, blending heavy metal aggression with almost orchestral arrangements. Fans who witnessed his work with Ozzy on Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman knew he was carving his own path. Decades later, in 2022, Ozzy Osbourne himself weighed in on the supposed rivalry during an interview with Rolling Stone. He pushed back against Eddie's claim, saying, "I recently heard that Eddie said he taught Randy all of his licks." He never did, to be honest. Randy didn't have a nice thing to say about Eddie. Maybe they had a falling out or whatever, but they were rivals. Ozzy's words suggested that the animosity wasn't one-sided. Randy, too, had little affection for Eddie, seeing him not as an influence, but as competition. The roots of their conflict stretched back to the Sunset Strip in the late 70s, when Rhoads' band Quiet Riot and Van Halen were both hustling for attention and fighting for record deals. Both bands played the same clubs, courted the same fans, and worked under the same pressures. According to Andre Relis, director of the 2022 documentary Randy Rhoads, Reflections of a Guitar Icon, this rivalry was present even before Ozzy plucked Randy from obscurity. Relis explained that there had always been tension between the two guitarists, fueled by the competitive environment of Los Angeles' hard rock scene. Michael Anthony. For decades, Michael Anthony's soaring background vocals and solid bass lines provided the bedrock of Van Halen's sound, yet his role within the band was never truly secure. His fallout with the Van Halen brothers was one of the most bitter and drawn-out conflicts in rock history, leaving Anthony with deep regret that he and Eddie Van Halen never reconciled before Eddie's death in October 2020. The tension can be traced back as far as 1984, when Van Halen had reached the peak of its commercial dominance. Despite the fact that Anthony had been there from the band's early club days, helping shape its identity, both Eddie and Alex Van Halen, along with then frontman David Lee Roth, began to question whether Anthony's contributions merited an equal share of the band's profits. Van Halen was a juggernaut, and money was pouring in at unprecedented levels, but Anthony found himself on the outside of financial decisions. The situation escalated to the point where the Van Halen brothers pressured him into retroactively signing away his rights to songwriting credits and future royalties. This effectively demoted him from being a founding partner to a salaried employee. Noel Monk, the band's manager during the group's most turbulent years, was appalled by the treatment Anthony received. He later called the move the most despicable thing he had ever witnessed in his 40 years in the music industry. A damning statement from a man who had seen his fair share of rock and roll treachery. The rift widened over the years, though Anthony remained loyal. When Eddie and Alex reunited with Sammy Hagar for a 2004 reunion tour, the initial plan was to exclude Anthony entirely. Eddie, by this point battling personal demons and physical decline, reportedly wanted to bring in other musicians, but Hagar refused to perform without Anthony. Out of loyalty to his old bandmate, Anthony agreed to participate, but only under humiliating terms. He was forced to accept a massive pay cut and sign away all rights to the Van Halen name and logo. This tour would mark the last time he ever played with the band. The final break came in 2006. On September 8th of that year, Van Halen announced that Eddie's teenage son, Wolfgang, would be stepping in as the group's new bassist. Anthony wasn't told directly. Instead, he discovered his replacement the same way fans did, on the internet. Stung by the cold dismissal, Anthony remarked, "I'm a little miffed that they're calling it a Van Halen reunion. If I was dead and they needed someone to play, that's one thing. But to me, this is not a reunion." His words underscored not only the personal betrayal he felt, but also his frustration at being written out of the band's legacy. In later interviews, Anthony revealed that after the 2004 tour, he never spoke to Eddie Van Halen again. The silence stretched for 16 years, through Eddie's long health struggles and eventual passing. Unlike Hagar, who was able to reconnect with Eddie shortly before his death, Anthony never got the chance to mend fences. It was a painful reality for a man who had once considered Eddie a brother. Sammy Hagar. When David Lee Roth exited Van Halen in 1985, many believed the band would crumble without its wild, charismatic frontman. Instead, Eddie Van Halen turned to Sammy Hagar, a seasoned rocker with solo hits like I Can't Drive 55 and a reputation as a powerhouse vocalist. The pairing clicked instantly. Within months, Van Halen had reinvented itself, ushering in what fans would later call the Van Hagar era. The chemistry produced 4 multi-platinum albums: 5150, 1986, OU 812, 1988, For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, 1991, and Balance, 1995, all of which topped the charts and cemented the group's commercial dominance. But behind the success, cracks began to show. The camaraderie that once fueled the band's creative energy slowly eroded, especially during the recording of Balance in 1994 to 95. Hagar, newly a father, was eager to spend time with his baby and expected a well-earned break after the grueling tour cycle. Eddie and Alex Van Halen, however, had a very different mindset. The brothers were eager to return to the studio immediately, seeing little reason to pause when their momentum remained so strong. The disagreement turned into a full-blown war of wills. Hagar felt the brothers were dismissive of his personal life, while Eddie and Alex saw his desire for time off as a lack of commitment. By mid-1996, the relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. To this day, both sides give conflicting accounts of what happened. Eddie insisted that Hagar quit, walking away when the pressure mounted. Hagar, however, has always maintained that he was fired. Hagar vividly recalled the moment in his autobiography, Red, My Uncensored Life in Rock. It was Father's Day, Sunday morning, 9 a.m. I was laying in bed with my brand new baby when the phone rang. Eddie goes, "You know, you always just want to be a solo artist, so go ahead and be one. We're going to get Dave back in the band." For Hagar, the words stung. Not only was he being cast aside during a life-changing personal moment, but he also felt blindsided by the band's decision to reach out to Roth after more than a decade apart. The bitterness spilled out into public view as Hagar launched into scathing critiques of Eddie's behavior and appearance in his memoir. According to Hagar, by the mid-1990s, Eddie was a shadow of the guitar god who had once revolutionized rock music. He described him as unkempt, hunched over, painfully thin, drinking wine straight from the bottle, and suffering visible health problems, including missing teeth and part of his tongue after a cancer scare. These brutal depictions painted a picture of a man consumed by inner demons, far removed from the glamorous rock star image fans idolized. Yet time has a way of softening even the harshest grudges. When Eddie Van Halen passed away in October 2020, Hagar publicly expressed both grief and gratitude. He admitted regret over exposing Eddie's darkest struggles in such a raw and unflattering way, acknowledging that those years were marked by pain and illness rather than malice. More importantly, he shared that he and Eddie had reconciled before his death, making peace after decades of feuding. Mftley Crfe. By 1984, Mftley Crfe had established themselves as one of the most notorious young bands on the Los Angeles scene, blending sleazy glam metal with an even sleazier offstage reputation. That year, they joined one of the most iconic hard rock lineups in history, the Monsters of Rock Tour, featuring Van Halen and AC/DC. For any band, this was a career-making opportunity, performing alongside legends, earning respect from peers, and reaching tens of thousands of fans every night. But for Mftley Crfe, still basking in the chaos of their meteoric rise, the tour would also be defined by a bizarre and reckless ritual they referred to as their biting phase. As drummer Tommy Lee explained years later to USA Today, the band had a peculiar way of showing affection. "Mftley had this thing we would do if we really loved you," Lee said. "Some people high-five, other people hug. We would bite you." To the crew, it was a twisted badge of camaraderie, an inside joke that bonded them. But to the unsuspecting recipients, it was anything but endearing. The most infamous moment came when frontman Vince Neil, already well known for his wild behavior, decided to test this ritual on none other than Eddie Van Halen. Without hesitation, Neil sank his teeth into Eddie's hand. An unthinkable move, especially considering Eddie's hands were his livelihood. Night after night, Eddie's unparalleled guitar work electrified stadiums, and now one of those hands had been the target of a drunken, ill-advised stunt. Eddie was furious. He immediately called Tommy Lee and, in a fit of rage, demanded, "What the fat is wrong with you?" The situation escalated quickly. Mftley Crfe's bassist, Nikki Sixx, later admitted that their biting antics nearly got them kicked off the Monsters of Rock tour altogether. It wasn't just Van Halen who had taken offense. The biting spree extended to other bands, and few tolerated it. Lee himself confessed to biting Malcolm Young of AC/DC, a decision that backfired spectacularly. Malcolm, famously no-nonsense and fiercely protective of his band, was not amused in the slightest. "I bit Malcolm Young and he hated it too," Lee recalled. "We did that for a couple of years until we were either overrich or realized it might be a little dangerous." Behind the scenes, Mftley's manager Doc McGee was left scrambling to do damage control. On the Talk is Jericho podcast in 2015, McGee revealed just how bad things got after the Van Halen incident. "It turned into a massive altercation," he said. "I had to apologize every single day for Mftley's behavior." McGee knew the stakes. This tour was far too important to jeopardize with juvenile antics. But convincing the crew to tone down their chaos was no small task. From Van Halen's perspective, the insult cut deeper than just an annoying prank. For Eddie, whose hands were sacred instruments, being bitten was not only disrespectful, but also dangerous. Even the slightest injury could have compromised his ability to perform at the level fans expected. For a perfectionist like Eddie, the idea that another band's drunken antics might derail his career was infuriating. Geddy Lee of Rush. The worlds of Van Halen and Rush rarely intersected musically. One was flamboyant, hard partying, and built around explosive guitar pyrotechnics, while the other was cerebral, precise, and rooted in progressive rock experimentation. Yet when the two bands did cross paths, sparks flew, leading to a series of awkward and at times hostile encounters between Eddie Van Halen and Geddy Lee that fans still discuss today. The tension began in 1981, during Van Halen's Fair Warning tour stop in Leicester, England. After an electrifying performance that showcased Eddie's unparalleled guitar wizardry, the band returned to their hotel ready to celebrate. What they didn't know was that Rush had already booked the hotel bar for themselves, renting out not only the space, but all the alcohol in it. To Van Halen, however, such boundaries hardly mattered. Without hesitation, the band and their crew helped themselves to nearly every bottle in sight, draining Rush's private stash. The Rush camp was understandably annoyed, but the situation quickly shifted from irritation to uneasy camaraderie. Soon enough, members of both bands were drinking together. Geddy Lee, ever the music enthusiast, even played Rush songs on a tape recorder to entertain the gathering. That was when disaster struck. Eddie Van Halen, with a drink in hand, joined Geddy for a chat. But in a moment of clumsiness, Eddie spilled his drink directly into the tape recorder. The room went quiet. For Rush, known for their discipline and professionalism, Eddie's carelessness didn't come off as rock and roll charm. It came off as disrespect. Though tensions didn't boil over that night, the encounter left a bad taste. Roughly a year later, the friction resurfaced, this time in Las Vegas. Both Rush and Van Halen were scheduled to perform, but the rumor circulating backstage was that Rush had banned anyone connected with Van Halen from attending their show. Whether the rumor was true or not, it reflected how frayed relations had become. The situation reached a breaking point when Geddy Lee attempted to extend an olive branch, or at least a handshake. According to Lee Roth, Geddy approached Eddie with his hand out, ready to greet him. But fate intervened in the most embarrassing way possible. Van Halen's overzealous security guard, apparently unfamiliar with who Geddy Lee was, mistook the gesture as a threat. In an instant, he body-tackled Geddy, sending him sprawling and ejecting him from the table. Geddy feels one way or another and comes up to say something to Ed, Roth later recalled. He puts up his hand to shake hands. Now, one of our security guards didn't have the vaguest idea who he was, and he came up and body-tackled him. He threw him out of the table, and that's the last I saw of him. For Geddy, the incident was humiliating but also surreal. In a 2014 Q&A with Rolling Stone, he reflected on the memory with a chuckle, saying only, "Oh, that is an interesting memory." His light-hearted recollection suggested that, with decades of distance, the sting had faded into something more amusing than bitter. Still, the encounters highlighted the stark differences between the two bands. Rush valued precision, order, and mutual respect, while Van Halen thrived on chaos, indulgence, and spontaneity. Eddie Van Halen and Geddy Lee were both geniuses in their own right, but their personalities and approaches to music and life could not have been further apart. Lee Roth. When Lee Roth first tried to join Van Halen in the early 1970s, it wasn't an easy sell. Eddie Van Halen, protective of his band's identity and sound, wasn't immediately convinced Roth was the right fit. Roth's larger-than-life personality, flamboyant stage presence, and obsession with showmanship stood in stark contrast to Eddie's quiet intensity and focus on musicianship. Yet after several auditions and persistent attempts to prove his worth, Roth was officially welcomed as the band's lead singer in 1973. The partnership would prove both incredibly successful and dangerously volatile. From the beginning, Roth and Eddie clashed creatively. Roth gravitated toward writing upbeat, party-friendly anthems about women, dancing, and good times, songs he knew would draw massive crowds and radio airplay. Eddie, meanwhile, longed to push the boundaries of rock with darker, more innovative, and musically complex material. This push and pull defined Van Halen's career throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, with both men fighting to shape the band's identity. The tension boiled over during the recording of Fair Warning in 1981. Eddie envisioned an album filled with darker riffs, moodier themes, and layered instrumentation. While it produced some of his most ambitious guitar work, the record ended up being the band's slowest-selling album to date. Feeling the sting of commercial disappointment, Roth pushed back hard on their next project, Diver Down, 1982, where his preference for light-hearted pop covers dominated. Eddie was frustrated, claiming the album diluted the band's originality. Then came 1984, the album that catapulted Van Halen into global superstardom. With hits like Jump, Panama, and Hot for Teacher, the record leaned heavily into pop accessibility, reflecting Roth's vision. It was a smash, but the creative rift between Eddie and Roth had widened to an unbridgeable gulf. After the subsequent tour, Roth abruptly quit the band, citing differences over artistic control. In his 1998 autobiography, Crazy from the Heat, Roth bitterly recalled that Van Halen's music before his exit had become morose, clearly taking a jab at Eddie's darker direction. Roth was replaced by Sammy Hagar, and the Van Hagar era carried the band through the late 1980s and early 1990s. But in 1996, after Hagar's dismissal, the original lineup briefly reunited, igniting massive anticipation. The reunion, however, imploded almost immediately. Their appearance at the 1996 MTV Video Music Awards, the first with all 4 classic members in 11 years, was supposed to be triumphant. Instead, Roth repeatedly went off script, hogging the spotlight, and Eddie eventually had to pull him from the microphone. Backstage, things got worse. Eddie casually mentioned needing hip replacement surgery before a reunion tour could happen, a comment Roth took as an embarrassment. Heated words followed, and the two nearly came to blows. Any chance of reconciliation disintegrated. A month later, Van Halen announced they had hired Gary Cherone, of Extreme, as their new frontman. Feeling betrayed, Roth penned a furious open letter declaring, "It sickens me that the quote-unquote reunion as seen on MTV was nothing more than a publicity stunt." Van Halen's camp fired back bluntly. "We parted company with David Lee Roth 11 years ago for many reasons." Though Roth and Eddie's relationship remained bitter, time softened the edges. In 2007, Roth rejoined Van Halen once again, and the band embarked on highly lucrative tours, proving their chemistry on stage was still magnetic despite years of conflict. But the story reached its final chapter in October 2020, when Eddie Van Halen passed away after a long battle with cancer. With his death, Van Halen officially disbanded, closing the book on one of rock's most explosive partnerships. What do you think about rockers hating Eddie Van Halen? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.